It usually started without warning. Drivers would be moving through a normal stretch of highway in northern Mexico, midday traffic, delivery trucks, people commuting between towns, and then traffic would suddenly stop, not because of an accident or congestion, but because the road had been deliberately blocked. Two trucks would pull across opposite ends of the highway, while armed men stepped out almost immediately after. Their engines were often left running, doors stayed open. The entire operation moved quickly enough that most drivers barely had time to react before the road was already under control. What stood out to witnesses later wasn't panic or chaos, but how coordinated everything felt. The men communicated mostly through hand signals and appeared to already know exactly where they needed to be. Some moved vehicle to vehicle collecting phones and keys, while others secured the perimeter and watched the surrounding roads. Within minutes, dozens of cars and civilians could be completely immobilized without a single shot being fired. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the blockade would end. The trucks moved. Traffic resumed. People got back into their vehicles and continued driving, but many who experienced these encounters described the same feeling afterward. It didn't feel random. It felt organized, almost rehearsed. By the early 2000s, incidents like this were becoming increasingly common across northern Mexico, particularly along highways and industrial routes connecting cities near the border. At first, there was no obvious sign that entire regions were beginning to change. There were no military checkpoints, no visible occupation, and no official declaration of control. But over time, patterns started becoming difficult to ignore. Police patrols taking the same routes each day began running into carefully timed ambushes or roadblocks. Officers responding to incidents would sometimes arrive only minutes after the people involved had already disappeared. Transport routes were interrupted with unusual consistency, often in areas where communication and response times were weakest. Investigators eventually realized something important. These attacks weren't reactive. The people carrying them out already seemed to know where patrols would be, how long responses would take, and which routes were most vulnerable at certain times of day. In other words, they weren't simply responding to movement, they were predicting it. That was when the name began to surface more frequently in reports and briefings: Los Zetas. At the time, most criminal groups in the region still operated with a degree of unpredictability. Violence tended to be reactive. Decisions were made in bursts, often shaped by immediate pressure rather than structure. This was different. Operations appeared timed in advance. Movements were coordinated across multiple points at once. Positions weren't improvised. They were already accounted for. And when an action began, it unfolded without visible hesitation, as if every step had already been assigned before anything happened. Police units began noticing it through their own routines. A checkpoint that had remained quiet for weeks would suddenly come under attack, often at the exact moment staffing levels were lowest. A convoy would be intercepted at locations where communication was weakest or delayed. Officers following consistent patrol schedules found themselves exposed in ways that didn't match chance or coincidence. Nothing about it looked random. Because it wasn't. In towns where their influence expanded, the changes were less visible, but more structural. There were no public declarations, no formal systems announced, but behavior shifted regardless. A shop owner would open as usual, and by later in the day, someone would arrive. No confrontation, no raised voice, just a figure, a number, and an expectation attached to it. Payments weren't framed as negotiation. They were framed as routine. The first time, it felt temporary. The second time, it felt established. After that, it became part of how things worked, and when someone failed to comply, the response didn't always come immediately, but it always came eventually, and it was never private. It was visible, not only to the individual, but to everyone around them. Shops adjusted their hours, streets grew quieter, conversations became shorter, more careful. People began avoiding attention in ways that weren't previously necessary. And occasionally, the pattern would break in a more direct way. Bodies appearing in public spaces, messages left behind, not detailed, not elaborate, just enough to remove any uncertainty about what had occurred and why. This wasn't disorder. It was structure, applied gradually until it became indistinguishable from the environment itself. And and it didn't remain confined to local businesses. What made the situation increasingly difficult to contain was the speed at which their operations expanded into other sectors. Traditional trafficking remained part of the structure, but it was no longer the central focus. New targets were added into the system. Fuel pipelines were accessed and redirected before authorities could trace the changes. Transport routes were monitored over time, then adjusted or rerouted depending on opportunity. Migrant flows moving through specific regions were intercepted, sometimes detained, sometimes leveraged for negotiation. Calls followed, demands were issued, deadlines were imposed, and even when conditions were met, outcomes were not guaranteed. What emerged was no longer a collection of separate activities. It functioned as a system, one designed to generate revenue across multiple channels simultaneously while also feeding intelligence back into itself. Each operation informed the next. Each movement refined the one that followed. The longer it ran, the more efficient it became. And the more efficient it became, the harder it was to disrupt without destabilizing the entire structure. Originally, this network operated within another organization, the Gulf Cartel. At that stage, Los Zetas functioned as its enforcement arm, carrying out operations on behalf of the broader group. But over time, that relationship began to shift. Independent networks formed, separate intelligence channels developed. Control over territory became more direct, more personal, less dependent on external command. Eventually, the separation was no longer theoretical. It became operational. When the split occurred, it did not unfold in a single moment. It escalated in phases. But once it began, the conflict developed quickly. Former allies began targeting shared infrastructure. Transport routes were intercepted. Personnel were redirected or eliminated. Regions that had previously remained stable became contested zones almost overnight. And the same systems that had once maintained order were now being used against each other. For a time, both sides continued functioning under pressure. Territory was still controlled. Revenue still flowed. Operations continued across multiple regions. From the outside, the structure still appeared intact, but systems built on this level of coordination depend on precise alignment across every layer. Communication has to remain consistent, leadership has to stay synchronized, and operational timing has to hold across all moving parts. When any of those begin to degrade, even slightly, the impact doesn't remain isolated. A delayed response in one region, a misinterpreted signal in another, an operation that proceeds without full coordination. Individually, these appear manageable, but over time, they begin to accumulate. And once that begins to happen, control doesn't disappear entirely. It changes. The structure remains in place, but the precision that once held it together starts becoming harder to maintain across the same scale. Responses become less consistent. Coordination becomes less reliable. Operations that once moved with timing and clarity begin showing signs of strain. Because the same system that allows an organization to expand across multiple regions also makes it dependent on every part continuing to function together. And when that balance starts to weaken, the effects usually aren't visible immediately. From the outside, things can still appear stable for a long time. Routes continue operating, territory still appears controlled, orders are still carried out, but internally, the structure is already changing. The discipline and coordination that built the system were still present. The network still existed. The influence hadn't disappeared, it just wasn't holding together as cleanly as before. And that was where the next phase began, because the structure they had built to manage pressure, enforce control, and organize violence across entire regions was about to face something far more difficult to coordinate around. Loss. Not a single event, but a series of disruptions that gradually altered the balance holding everything together. And once those losses entered the system, the effects didn't remain isolated. They spread outward, and as they spread, everything else began to shift with them.